Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of the screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. In this week's podcast, I have Tidbits. I have an update on my spinning breed study that I'm working on. I have a new sock on the needle that is out of this world, and I have an update on my vintage 1950s sweater jacket that's really more about how I approach fixing mistakes in my knitting. So let's get started. This first tidbit is really a reminder that I am always happy to help knitters with their project questions, but I can only do that in my Ravelry group if you post a new discussion thread in my Ravelry group. I am not able to answer personal project questions by Facebook Messenger, direct message on Twitter or Instagram, or even on Ravelry's direct message system. It needs to be in the discussion thread. That way, other people can learn from the question and the answers, and other people can also pitch in their answers. I don't always have the best answer or the right answer to a question. I usually have a suggestion for how you can go about answering that question, but there are many very experienced knitters in my group who are willing and able to jump in and give advice to people who are struggling with a project problem. So please, if you have a question about a project, start a new discussion thread in my Ravelry group. I always leave a link to my Ravelry group down in the video description. This tidbit came up in my probably Twitter and Instagram feed this week. This is something that came up in the Fleece to Fashion social media feed. It may be something I've shared before. I'd certainly seen it before, but I wanted to give a little context to it. What this is a tiny, tiny stocking that is affixed to the page of a book, like a textbook that was for children, teaching them how to knit. So kids in the UK were often sent to these industrial schools in order to learn skills so that they could be then employed as servants in a household, or so that they would know how to produce these items in their own homes in an economical fashion. So what's interesting about this particular textbook is that there were little miniature samples knitted for each of the items so that they could see what they were supposed to look like. There are many, many early knitting books that are available on archive.org and other places like that. I will leave a link down below to some that are of particular interest. But the 19th century is really when knitting books became a thing, and it started out as being instruction manuals for children, and also then led to women who were learning to knit and as a leisure activity as well. So there was plain needlework and there was fancy needlework. So plain needlework was for people who would be supplying their families with needed stockings or clothing items, or would be doing that for the households that they worked for. And fancy needlework was for women of more means, and they were producing decorative items for their homes. So usually that was considered a productive way for a woman to spend her time. Would be to be making items for her family, whether they had servants or not. But these early textbooks were definitely aimed at things like stockings, were some of the earliest patterns that were written down. This tidbit is one that I came across myself probably as I was Googling for something else. I don't even remember what my original search was. For those of you who've been following my podcast for a while and understand that I have this long-term project to knit a sweater from each decade between the 1890s and 1990s, one of the things that was true of sweater patterns prior to the end of World War II was that they only came in one size, and it was up to the knitter to change the sizing. Of course, there was no information given about what the finished size was or any information about gauge, but everything was given in one size, and then you had to to scale it up. Once we got to the mid-century, then patterns were graded for multiple sizes, and things were made much easier for the knitter. There was more instruction, specific instruction about what to do, less vague instruction that left it up to the knitter to decide, well, what increase am I going to use or decrease I'm going to use. It was spelled out for them for each of the sizes. There was also more complete information given about finished size as well. These days, we don't just have 3 sizes or 5 sizes in our sweater patterns. Often there might be as many as 12 sizes. That patterns have been graded for a much wider range of sizes. But one place where you still see this one size type of pattern is with Japanese sweater patterns. And one of the reasons for that is that they are completely given in a schematic form. So you'll see the standard schematic that has all of the information, and they will have charts for all of the stitch patterns. And then there is a way that these patterns are laid out to give you information about shaping and what stitch pattern is supposed to go where and how to do all that. But again, it's only in one size, and that sort of a pattern would be really difficult to do in multiple sizes. You'd have to have a separate schematic for each size in order to be able to do that. And I've always been curious about that, like why, how that came about. What do they do? Like, how do knitters know how to modify their sweaters? Well, I came across an article recently that is by a woman who has a Japanese knitting magazine, and she is writing her patterns differently, and it's taking some time to teach knitters in Japan how to read these other types of instructions that are written out. But she gives some information and some context about why these patterns come in one size and the difficulties that that can give even for people in Japan. And what the explanation was is that after World War II, when women were going to schools to learn garment construction so they could sew for their families, that was expected, and it would be the less expensive way of clothing the family would be to make those items themselves. That was when they were also learning to knit, and they were given the same sorts of schematics for knitting that they had for sewing. And then they were taught how to grade those different silhouettes up and down depending on who it was that they were knitting for. Well, that was the standard for how Japanese sweater patterns, knitting patterns were created, and it extends to today. The difference today is that women aren't going to school to learn garment construction and knitting in the same way that their grandmothers may have gone to school to do that. So these sweaters that they tend to create nowadays tend to be boxier and baggier so that there can be one size fits multiple body shapes, and that knitters don't know necessarily how to make those sizes bigger or smaller in order to fit them differently. I thought that was really interesting. I'm going to leave a link down below to that discussion. It was like a blog post. It was in conjunction with a knit along for a Cowichan style sweater that was actually produced by this Japanese company. And her sweater patterns are not done that way in just the one size, but she was giving an explanation of how to read those particular types of sweater patterns. So if you've ever been intrigued by Japanese sweater patterns and wondering how to read them, how to interpret them, you might find that article really interesting. I learned to spin 3 summers ago, and that first summer when I was taking classes, I was practicing a lot and I was having a lot of fun with it. And then the fall came and I really was starting to get back into knitting again, and I wasn't taking any more classes, and so I didn't have like a deadline to get this done before I went to my next class, and it kind of slid away from me. And part of the problem was that I was in a smaller office in the house, and so my spinning wheel wasn't in my office. It had to be in a different part of the house that I didn't see. And one of the things I've talked about this year as I moved into this office and trying to bring other crafts that I do into this office as well is understanding my organizational style, knowing that if it's out of sight, it's out of mind, and that in order for me to actually spin consistently, I needed to have my spinning wheel in a place where I saw it on a daily basis. One of the other challenges that I had with spinning was in the quantity of yarn that I was making and what I would do with that yarn once it was finished. I'm the kind of knitter who usually starts with my project in mind, figures out what do I want to make, what elements do I want that project to have, and then the last thing I do is figure out what yarn it's going to be. And it's usually a really basic yarn. I'm thinking about the color, and it's because I want the fun of the project for me is in the construction and the stitch patterns. So the yarn is like the means for me to get the resulting finished item. It isn't what I start with. And with spinning, as much as you might want to plan what your yarn is, and I'm not at the stage at all where I have that much control over my spinning. A lot of times what it is you make the yarn and then you decide what to do with it. And that's a harder challenge for me. And it's especially hard if I start with, say, 4 ounces of dyed comb top and I spin it up, and then what am I going to do with 4 ounces of yarn? Well, you can make a hat or you can make mittens, but there's a limit to how many hats and mittens I want to make. The things that I actually knit a lot of are sweaters and socks. So I'm not at the point where I feel like I can spin sock yarn, and I'm not at the point where I have the endurance to spin a sweater's worth of yarn. Like, I don't have that endurance, but also just the consistency, the ability to spin that consistently. So that's been the kind of the sticking point for me. So earlier this year, somebody, I think in the comments, was recommending a breed study that another YouTuber was doing, Fiber Love Diary, Trish at Fiber Love Diary. And it was a breed study of 30 different fibers, 30 different wool breeds, and it's 1 ounce a piece. And I'm like, oh, that's exactly what I wanted. I had looked for a breed study a few years ago that someone had told me about and was sold out, and I didn't know where else to look for it. Nowadays, there's so many people on Etsy that are selling these breed studies. So I ordered it, and to me, this seemed like the perfect thing. It was, there are these little 1 ounces of comb top, and they have a little tag that tells you what the breed is. It's ready to spin. And you could, it's all combed to top. You could card it if you wanted to, and I have done that with one of the wools so far. But it was like, this is like the perfect thing for me. It gives me practice in spinning a small quantity and finishing that yarn. I have 1 ounce of a specific wool breed. I spin that up. I get a yarn from it, and then, I can't really make something from that 1 ounce, but I could make part of a something with that 1 ounce. And so my idea was, I'm going to spin each of these up, make them into yarn, and I'm going to spin 1 breed each week, ply it, finish the yarn, and knit it up into a swatch. And then I will sew all of those swatches together. It will be like a reference library blanket, and I'll put labels on the back that tells me what breed this is. So that was my initial idea. And now that I'm a few weeks into it, and I'm seeing how it's actually going, at least at this point, I'm revising my plan. First of all, I have been able to spin the full ounce of each breed each week. But I haven't necessarily finished the yarn, and then I haven't knit up any of it yet, because I'm like, okay, these yarns are quite different from each other. What am I going to do for the squares? Somebody had a suggestion that I might want to knit 2 squares and try felting one to see which wools tend to felt more easily than others. So it just, as I've gotten into this, I've realized, okay, I've got more questions, and I've also got problems to solve, and how am I going to do that? So what I'm going to do is spin the first 5 and make sure that all the yarns are finished, and then figure out with those 5, what am I going to do with them? Am I going to knit multiple swatches? Am I going to try to knit them all the same size? What am I going to do with those 5? And that's going to be my beginner's reference library. And then after I'm done with that, then I'll do the next 5 and see how it goes. And so I anticipate that that I will get better as I go, and I'll find some other thing that I might be interested in looking at or doing with the yarn. So I'm breaking it down into kind of sub projects. Like every ounce of wool has multiple sub projects. There's the spinning, the plying, the finishing, the knitting, and then the evaluating of those things. So every one of those ounces has those sub projects, and then the bigger project is the entire breed study. But because I hadn't really defined it exactly, and I could see that things were working differently, and I'm just kind of modifying things. So I'm going to do it 5 breeds at a time and see if I'm going to add things or add different challenge levels, or how my skills developed, and what I might do based on how my skills develop. So that's my plan right now. Last week, I was showing you the finished first breed, which was a Cheviot or Cheviot, and there's a bunch of different names. And I hated my yarn. I thought it was underplied. I just hated it so much. And so my plan was I would run it through the spinning wheel and give it some more twist. And that worked really well. I don't love the yarn because it's a 2-ply, and I'm like, I really don't like 2-ply yarn. I'm not going to want to knit with it. I'm probably going to be unhappy with every yarn that's a 2-ply, but it is a much better yarn, and I will show you in the overhead what it looks like. The second yarn I did was Charolais, and I decided to card that one, and so it's a woolen spun, and I plied it differently. It's a 3-ply. I used a chain plying method that creates a 3-ply yarn. One of the reasons I wasn't happy with the 2-ply is because I was doing it as a center pull ball, and I was doing it as a center pull ball because it's just a small quantity. It's only an ounce. And I wasn't sure I was going to like that process, and there's issues with doing a center pull 2-ply that could be resolved by splitting the yarn onto 2 separate bobbins and then plying them in the conventional way. That's a lot more work to end up with a 2-ply yarn that I'm not going to like anyway. So that is not likely going to be in the future in this project. It's more likely that I will continue to do chain plying. But again, I might change my mind after I do the first 5. We'll see. The third fiber that I did for this week was Corriedale, which I had spun before. And one of the things I learned about Corriedale this week that I hadn't known before was that you need to spin it finer than you think you really want it, because it tends to puff up. And that was a huge revelation to me, because it was something that I had experienced, but nobody had given me the explanation that the reason that yarn puffed up so much was because it was Corriedale. Because I couldn't figure out, why that first yarn I had spun, 3 years ago, why it just got so giant after it was washed. I am learning a lot, and I just wanted to update you on how I'm revising the way that I'm approaching this breed study, and then how I'm going to evaluate it at each stage going forward. This is the Cheviot that I had underplied, that last week was underplied. So I ran it through the wheel a second time, and it's got more twist. It's still, uneven and not a beautiful yarn, but we'll see what it looks like once it's knit up into something. But I'm much happier with this than I was last week. So in contrast, this is one where I ran it through the carder, and I used a long draw, so it was woolen spun, and then I did a 3-ply. So it's much, you can see some places are really puffy at the end. But it's a much puffier yarn than this other one, and that's because of the woolen blend. And then it's a thicker yarn because it's a 3-ply instead of a 2-ply. And then this is the singles. The bobbin of singles that I spun this week. This is Corriedale. So I think I did a pretty good job with fairly consistent singles. We'll see what happens when it actually gets plied. But I felt like I was getting into a better rhythm and really getting my body in sync. My treadling and my drafting were in sync, and I just felt like I had better control over what I was doing, which is kind of the point. Last week, I was telling you about some yarns that I'd gotten from a couple of indie dyers. One was from Gauge Dye Works in Canada, and it was the solar system. It was called the Solar System Round Trip. And what it is a single skein that represents, it's self-striping yarn that represents the solar system with different color stripes for each of the planets. And then you get to the midpoint of the skein and then it reverses. That's why it's round trips. But that indicates where you cut the yarn so that you can get two identical skeins. And so Saturday morning when I got up, I was in one of those positions where all of my sub-projects were done. I didn't have anything actually on the needles. I had a single sock finished that I had started a few weeks ago with some yarn that I bought when I was down in Santa Fe. It's a yarn that is made from Polworth, and I was doing a toe-up sock using a new type of heel construction. That sock was done, so it was time to either start a second sock, start another piece of my Raglan jacket, or to work on my 60s vintage sweater, like sewing things up. But I had nothing on the needles. So I just kept thinking about that solar system yarn and how much I loved it. So instead of casting on the second sock for my Polworth yarn, I cast on the first sock of the solar system yarn. I love doing swatches because the purpose of a swatch is to get information. But it doesn't mean I do a lot of gauge swatches. A lot of times the yarns I'm using are ones I'm very familiar with, so I know exactly what needle size I need to get different gauges. And when I'm working with whatever the recommended gauge is on the ball band, I almost always know exactly what needle size I will need to get gauge. It's a little different when I'm making socks, because socks are knit at a firmer gauge, and which means you have to squish more stitches into a smaller space. And frequently I do a gauge swatch in that case when I'm using a new yarn and I'm looking at the kind of yardage that's in this yarn. Maybe it's spun by a different company, or it's made of a different wool breed, or it has a different construction. I'm not completely sure what needle size I'm going to need to get which gauge. And so I will do a gauge swatch in that case. When I did my Polworth socks, I knew I wanted to do 8 stitches per inch. And I didn't know what needle I would necessarily need, especially for this yarn. So I tried a US 1, which is a 2.25 millimeter needle. And I did get 8 stitches per inch. And so that made me happy. Normally when I'm knitting socks, I'm using like a Regia 4-ply or an Opal or Mail Invite, something, one of those German sock yarns that the yarn label will say 7.5 stitches per inch. That's if you wanted to make a stockinette sweater out of that sock yarn. But if you want to knit at a firmer gauge, you need to, you need more stitches. And so I will knit those yarns at 9 stitches per inch on a US 0. And that's what I know about those particular yarns. So the Polworth yarn, okay, I got 8 stitches per inch on a US 1, and I made that sock. So the solar system yarn, also I wanted to make at 8 stitches per inch. This is a completely different yarn construction than any of the yarns I have, the sock yarns. It is a merino twist. The way the yarn is constructed is that they have these single yarns that they ply together to make 2 plies. And so you have 4 strands of 2 plies. And then they ply those 4 together again in the same twist direction that they twisted when they plied the first time. This is called an S on S twist yarn. I did a video on this on how you can tell how these yarns are constructed, which I'll link to above and below. So I knew I'd never knit a sock yarn with an S on S twist, and this particular one, the yardage was different than what I'm used to. But I thought, oh well, the Polworth socks, I used a 1 to get 8 stitches per inch. I'm just going to use that same needle, and I started my toe up sock. And one of the things I love about self-striping yarn is watching the colors emerge. What stripe, what color is going to come next? How long is it going to be? I just love, watching what's going to come next. So I started the sock. This is the sun, and then we've got Mercury and Venus and Earth. And when I got to the point where I had the full stitch count, I looked at the stitches and I thought these seem slightly bigger than what I would expect. I tried the sock on. I'm like, this feels not quite as tight as I would normally like. And so I measured the gauge, and it was not right. It was like 7.5 stitches per inch, not 8 stitches per inch. And yet I couldn't stop knitting this because of the striping sequence. I knit the whole foot. I knit all of the gusset increases, and it was time to start the heel. And I thought, Roxanne, this is going to be, you want to use all the yarn it's going to potentially be a knee sock. You're going to knit this entire sock and then in a second one, and it's not fitting you the way that you like. Why would you do that? So I'm like, oh, okay. I'm going to start over. So this is a situation where when I realize after I've started that I'm going to have to rip out the whole thing because the gauge is wrong. There's something like just wrong that I can't use this. I don't rip this out. I start over with the correct needle size and another ball of yarn. So I have 2 matching balls of yarn. So I started again. I did do a little gauge swatch to confirm. So I need a size 0 with this yarn to get my 8 stitches per inch, even though I usually use the size 0 to get 9 stitches per inch with a different yarn. So this is, why I need to do gauge swatching with sock yarns, because there is more variability in that. So I started the foot again. I thought I wouldn't be as interested. I was just as happy going through the solar system. I got to the heel. I did the heel. And I started going up the leg. Well, this is the point up the leg. So I actually have finished the entire sock. I went so fast. I've never knit a sock so fast. I realized I needed to do some calf shaping up here. And I wasn't sure how long the sock was going to be. I was going to knit it as long as the yarn lasted. And I was trying to figure out when I would start the calf shaping, how I would do it, what I was going to do at this point if it didn't reach all the way. Like, how was I going to work out this calf shaping? So what I did is by the time, I got past the heel and I was a little ways here, I always have a spreadsheet of my project. So, and I have a little scale that I use that I can keep weighing my yarn. And so I can look and see how many stitches per gram I'm getting. And then based on how many grams of yarn I have, how many total stitches I potentially could have in the completed sock. So that helped me kind of plan out the total length, like where I would be ending the shaping, because this doesn't quite come up all the way up to right below my knee. It's, it's about this much shorter. I could not find any good information on how to calculate the sock leg. I made some decisions based on what I know about fit, what I know about negative ease, what I know about how much length I lose because of the negative ease of the sock, because it has to stretch this way, you lose some length that way. And I ended up with something that I'm really pleased with and it really fits. I posted the picture on Instagram and someone said, oh, I'm dying to know how you did the calf shaping. And I'm like trying to figure out how to explain it in a way that would be useful. So I have been looking for a lot of sock calculators and recipes to see what other people are suggesting. And some of the things that like there's a sock calculator that just, it gives wrong information. And there are some where they're really not talking about using much in the way of negative ease for the leg, which kind of surprised me. I'm curious about how other people, like I love the way this sock fits. I'll put it in and I'll show you guys how it fits. See if I can get my foot up there. And get it up, there we go. I knit this sock, so it's got 10% negative ease around the ankle, which is perfectly common. And then when I got up to the point where it was about 25% negative ease. When my leg was big enough that the sock circumference, the difference between the sock circumference and my leg circumference was, 25%. That's when I started doing the increases. So everything up here has about 25% negative ease, and I feel like that creates, it's not too tight, but it's snug, it's going to fit. A lot of the knee-high sock patterns are calling for essentially no negative ease, either no negative ease or just like a half an inch or something. And I like 2 to 3 inches. 3 inches of negative ease is what I have for my leg, and I feel like it fits really well. So I've been curious about some of you maybe who have knit knee socks before, if you have found that you prefer more negative ease than what the patterns are calling for, because I would be happy to explain my process. I feel like it works for me, but I'm really curious about other people's experiences with knee-high patterns, and especially with recipes and calculators, and if you were happy with the results that you got. And I'm using a toe-up round toe. I did a video on this a couple weeks ago. And then I'm using this version of a heel flap and gusset construction that I got from Modern Daily Living, which I will link to below. But I modified it so that I would have more, a longer gusset, so that I would have more stitches. I'm still not sure if I'm completely happy with the fit on this, but I can certainly wear it and get it on my foot. That part is fine. You can see that the increases that I did go up the back. I have 2 plain stitches up the center, and then I would do mirrored increases. I was doing them every 6 rows. So I would do an increase, do 5 rows, then do an increase, 5 rows, increase, etc. All the way up until I got to where the widest part of my calf muscle is, which just happens to be where this Pluto line is. I only kept this for 1 inch. I think it would be better if it was 2 inches long. But I really don't know what the right amount of length is for this maximum distance. And then I did a couple of decreases to get down to what I would want for under my knee. Now, I probably didn't need these decreases because this doesn't end right under my knee. It ends a little short of that. So I probably could have just done either no decreases here, or 1 set of decreases right before the ribbing. Would have probably been fine as well. This was a test. It was an experiment to see how it would fit and what my process might be, and it will, I'm sure, be refined, not for the next sock, but for the next pair of socks. So I currently am juggling a number of different types of things. I'm juggling the spinning with the knitting. I also do videos. I have some sewing I've been wanting to, I've been doing this year. I haven't done any for a month or so, but that's one of the things I want to rotate through. I'm working really hard at figuring out how to balance all of those things and how to make sure I'm getting done the things that I want to do, while also giving myself flexibility to discover new and different things, because that's something I really need. I need some structure, but I need flexibility. One of the things I do is I break projects down into sub-projects, which is one of the reasons I really like knitting sweaters in pieces, because I don't mind seaming. It's not my favorite thing. It's not knitting, but I don't mind it. I'm good at it. I learned how to do it. I think it's important to learn how to seam so that you don't prevent yourself from knitting something just because it has to have seams in it. But I really like knitting sweaters in pieces because I like the smaller pieces, and I feel like, oh, I'm getting done faster. When I have to knit a sweater seamlessly all in one piece, I find that sort of psychologically draining, because it just feels like a never-ending hallway of knitting, where with pieces, I got the front done, or I got the back done, or I got this sleeve done, or I got the neckband done. It's just different things. And when I get one of those done, I feel very good about, okay, well, now I want to knit a sock. And then I get one sock done. Well, now I want to knit the second sleeve. So for me, it's just a really good way of keeping myself doing all of the things I want to do without ever feeling like things are a complete slog. Something I've been doing the past few weeks is just kind of writing down everything that I want to do in a particular week on a whiteboard. I used to try to do this kind of thing and then assign what I was going to do on any given day. And that would fall apart in the first day. And I would just feel bad about myself. I'm not sticking to it. I don't have discipline. I can't ever, follow through, the negative self-talk. So what I realized that I need to do is have the structure of knowing what I need to do during the week. So I put it on my whiteboard and I look at it every morning. What are the things I need to do? But then I get to decide, what am I going to do today? Like sometimes there's things I have to do. I have to get a haircut, or I have to make a video, or I have to do this, or I have to do that. It gives me that flexibility, but it gives me the flexibility within that structure. And so then I cross it out. I was thinking, oh, I should just erase it. And so then the list gets smaller and smaller. And then I realized, no, I want to be reminded of everything I've accomplished. I don't want to erase the things that I've accomplished. So this has been working for me. And it's also helping me figure out how to juggle things. And one of the things that I did this week was I planned to knit one sleeve for my 1950s jacket. And yesterday I decided to knit the second one. And so I finished it. I wrote sleeve number 2 on here yesterday, and then I crossed it out. So because it's something I did this week and I want to be able to see that. Last week I was telling you about there was an error in the left front. I was marking off where, let's see, here we go. I was marking off where where the buttons were going to be, so that when I knit the other front, I would know when to time the buttonholes. And I noticed that there was right near where this button was going to be, right at the edge of the garter stitch, there was a stray purl bump. I had extended the garter ridge 1 stitch too far. I'd already finished it. It was already blocked. And so I decided I was going to do surgery on it. Somebody was asking me, well, it's so close to the top. You're going to have extra ends to weave in. Why wouldn't you just rip it all out? It goes so fast. Why don't you just rip it out? So every knitter can decide what works for them. One of the things that I think about when I come across an error is, do I actually need to fix this or not? Is this something that I can just compensate for? So if I'm doing, and I'll show you in the overhead, like some examples on when I was knitting the sleeves and I was supposed to be doing increases at each end. And what happened up near the top was I did an increase, and then for some reason 2 rows later I did another one. And I was like, oh, I didn't mean to do that. So this was right near the top. So what happened was I think I was supposed to do 8 or 10 increases altogether. And so let's say this was number 7, and then I was supposed to do 1 more up here. I just skipped that one. So I had all of the stitches I needed on this edge, and I just skipped the last one. And so I have, 2 of the increases are fairly close to each other. That it didn't matter to me. And I think I have a case over here where on one of the edges I forgot to do the increase, and so then on the next row I did the increase at that point. So they're a little further apart or a little closer together, one on each edge. That, to me, that's something I can compensate for. I don't need to fix, because it's right next to a seam line. It's going to be under my arm. I still end up with the right number of stitches. That is not a problem. So that's the first thing. Do I actually need to fix it at all, or can I compensate for it? And then the second thing is, if I do need to fix it, what is the way, what can I do that will not force me to have to reknit everything else that is perfectly fine? Because if I rip everything back to the point where the mistake was, and I fix the mistake, then I have to reknit everything going forward. I could make another mistake, which I would then have to either fix or, whatever. So if everything is fine except for that one stitch, I am not going to rip back. If stitches are still on the needles, if I find it like a few rows later, oh, I see a problem. Again, I don't rip back to that point. I use a technique called laddering down. I'll link to up here and down below, where I just drop the stitches that are a problem, that span of stitches. I drop them all down so that maybe there's 6 stitches I have to drop down. I recapture them with a double pointed needle, and then I re-knit them on the double point back up to the point. So I'm only correcting the portion where the error is. Now sometimes I have to rip back, like when I discovered that I had made an error way back in the pocket that completely screwed up the stitch count for everything, for the whole sweater. It messed everything up. And so I did have to rip back to that point, because even though the stitches looked okay, there weren't the right numbers of them, and the shaping wasn't working out correctly. So in that case, I had to rip back. But in this case, surgery seemed like the best option to fix that one particular mistake. It was going to be a very easy fix. I have never done surgery. I know exactly how stitches are constructed, and I knew what I needed to do to fix it, but I had never done it before. And so I was interested in learning to fix this particular problem using surgery. It was a really safe, easy fix to do using surgery. And I wanted to do that. So I haven't woven in the ends yet. So I do have a few more ends. I have, this is the section that I took out. I snipped a stitch in here, and I pulled the yarn from that row out, and it had been blocked, so everything was really curly. And then I introduced a new strand of yarn that I grafted everything together along that end. So I do have some ends to weave in. But I've learned something. I've learned, like, oh, what my approach is going to be the next time I need to do surgery, particularly if it's something more complicated. Now, if this hadn't worked out, if I had made a real huge mess of it, I still would have had the option of ripping everything back. But this way, I avoided having to rip back, and I got to learn something, and it turned out just fine. And so I have a couple extra ends to weave in, no big deal. Somebody had asked if there was a video on it, or would there be a video, and I'll probably do a Technique Tuesday video on this at some point. I did record my process doing this. I knew how to do it theoretically, but I didn't necessarily know like the best approach. So that's always a problem. I did try to record myself doing it, but this yarn is really dark. It doesn't photograph well. And because I was trying to figure out what I was doing, my head was forward and the camera was taking a picture of my head. So when I do Technique Tuesday videos, I choose a yarn that is going to show up well on camera, like a green like this or blue like this. And I plan it out. I'm doing swatches several days ahead of time to kind of rehearse. How am I going to show this? How am I going to teach this? How am I going to present this? Am I going to show a finished example side by side with one that I'm demonstrating in person? You know, it's just different. I very rarely, if ever, demonstrate something on a project that I'm currently working on, even though that project might inspire a technique video. Usually the yarn color is just not going to work. With socks, oftentimes the stitches are so tiny that in order to, I have to zoom in so far that I end up in digital zoom, and it's just difficult to capture what's going on in a way that so that you can actually see the stitches. So I will do a video at some point on how to do that kind of surgery. But I also wanted to show you that there are other things. Sometimes you can cover up your mistakes without cutting anything, without ripping back. I want to show you something that has been in a sweater that I've worn many times on my channel. So this is a sweater that I knit years ago, and this was knit top down. So the sweater started up here. It took me a couple of winters to knit this. I didn't knit it straight through. I was knitting other projects. But it was a long and complicated project. I was really happy with it. And I think it had been done for like 6 months. Maybe I got to the end of the summer and I was going to wear it for the first time in the fall. And I tried it on and I was looking in the mirror And I was admiring the cables, and I was looking at the top, and I was going all the way down looking at these cables, and my eye stopped right here. I was like, oh, what is that? And I was looking in the mirror. I looked down on my body. I could not see where the error was. So I had to look in the mirror again to find that location, and then look down at my body to see where that actually was. This is something that I didn't want to do surgery on because it was a more complicated stitch pattern, and I'd never done surgery before on a sweater. I didn't want to risk screwing it up. And so this was something where I have just left it in there, and every time I know it's there and I have to look for it, it takes some effort for me to find it. So what I want to show you is how I can actually fix this. I'm going to actually fix this right now, not with surgery. So on right side rows, these cables cross, and they will cross toward each other on one right side row, and then on the next right side row, they will cross away from each other. And it's always, each one of these cable crossings is 2 stitches. It's either this one crossing over that stitch, or this one crossing over that stitch. That's all it is. So this is the only error in this entire sweater, is right here where one stitch is crossing another one to the right when it should be crossing to the left. If you look at the stitch that's crossing over the top, you can see that it's coming out of this stitch right here. That means the stitch that's crossing under is coming out of the stitch that's next to it right here. So it should be coming out on top instead of underneath. So I'm going to bring a strand of yarn up through the center of this stitch here. And here's the stitch that's underneath. It's right here. It's wrapped around the base of that stitch. So I'm going to come underneath here. And then I'm going to go back in the center of that stitch down here. Let's see, so where is the cable that I just fixed? Right here. So now I have fixed that cable. So I just put that stitch on top of the other one. I have 2 ends that I need to weave in right here, but that's all it took to fix that stitch. And in order for me to see again where it is, I have to pull on the yarns right here, but this is the stitch. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.